So welcome to this ratio dialogue on why education is a social waste. We're going to meet with Professor Bryan Caplan here from George Mason University, and we're going to discuss his new book, The Case Against Education, why the education system is a waste of time and money. It recently came out, and I think it's highly relevant for anyone interested not only in education, but also in the future prosperity and perhaps liberty of our societies. So, Bryan, you're a professor of economics. You've done work on the myth of the rational voter, selfish reasons to have many kids. And why did you write this book? What triggered your interest in this area?
Well, from the age of 5, I've been puzzled by what's going on in school because it seems like so much of what you learn, you never need to know after the final exam. But then employers care, and that's weird. Right? It's weird that they would teach so much material that appears to be irrelevant to the real world, and yet employers will say, hey, you're one Aristotle class short of your degree. I'm not going to look at your application. And this book is really my effort to figure out what's going on.
Still, that's a big educational premium in many countries, especially in the US, I would say.
Absolutely.
So if you invest in a long university education, you're better paid.
Oh, that's absolutely.
So that's a puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really the heart of the puzzle. Like, why was there such a big payoff in the market for studying material that seems so irrelevant? And the answer that I give is, by itself, not original to me. So, the economist Michael Spence has a Nobel Prize for what's called the signaling model of education. And what it says is that in addition to the normal story about why education pays, the normal story being that you learn useful skills and then employers value those skills, there's another story which says that studying and doing well at anything helps convince employers, helps persuade employers that you are going to be a good worker. Basically, if you do well in school, then employers will think, well, even if what he studied isn't really important or relevant, still shows that he's smart, shows he's hardworking, and also shows that he's just conformist, willing to go and follow the rules and comply with what authorities say, right? And this too can actually raise your earnings, but in a totally different way than the usual one where you're acquiring useful skills. One says that you are being transformed by the education. It's changing what you're able to do. The other story says, no, what's going on is that you are changing people's minds about your value. Right, that you are persuading people that you have what you had to begin with.
That's what signaling.
Yes, that's what signaling is all about.
Let's come back to this because I think this is hard for people to understand really what you mean here.
Sure.
But still, I mean, the OECD countries, the developing countries, Sweden, Canada, US, they have 50% of people going to college nowadays.
Where the U.S. 70% of high school graduates start college.
And we think that's a good policy. We think it promotes growth. And in Sweden and this country, we had double the size of the educational system, more or less, in the last 20 years or so.
And
that's a mistake. That's a mistake in your view.
Yeah. So, of course, the countries that do very big changes in education, usually afterwards, if they look back, they say, well, what did we get out of this? Here's the key thing. If the main thing that education does is teach useful skills, then when more people get more education, this transforms the economy. Suddenly, you can have lots of high-skill jobs. You can build new industries because the workers are now ready to work in those industries. But if my story is right, then the main thing you're going to get is what's called credential inflation. This is where once everyone has one sticker on their forehead, employers say, well, one sticker doesn't convince me that you're a smart, hardworking, and conformist anymore. Almost everybody's got that. Now you need 2 stickers or 3 stickers. And in the book, I go over the evidence on this credential inflation for the U.S. It's something that almost anyone who's worked for 10, 20, 30 years senses.
What commonly is called overeducation.
Yes,
right?
Yes. But when we say overeducation, then it's a little odd because it makes it sound like, well, or how can you have too much of this good thing? Whereas credential inflation, I think, really captures the problem. It says that rather than people with more education getting better jobs, you need more education to get the same jobs that your parents or grandparents had. So, really, over the last 2 or 3 generations in the United States, the amount of education they need to get one and the same job has gone up by about a full degree. So what this means is that, to be a waiter now, definitely at least at most restaurants, you need a high school degree or maybe even a college degree for a nice restaurant. To be a bartender at a nice bar, and again, it seems crazy. It's like you need to go to college to be a bartender. Like, why would that be? And yet, if you're in the position of someone that is hiring bartenders at a nice bar, you're there saying, well, I have all these applications. I don't have time to interview everybody. Why not go and favor the people that have already demonstrated that they have a lot of good traits?
So a general policy problem is that there's a skill shortage at the same time as we invest in education. And your story is part of the explanation of this.
Well, what I'm saying is that there's always a skill shortage. Like, it would always be better if people magically just had more genuine skills. But what most countries do to increase skills is something that's totally irrelevant, or almost totally irrelevant to skills, which is just to send people to school for more time. And again, the real place people learn skills is on the job, learning by doing, practice. So you might remember Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers some years back, saying that the key to becoming a master is practicing for 10,000 hours, this 10,000-hour rule. That turns out to be exaggerated. A lot of people can practice for 10,000 hours and they're still not very good. But if you tone it down and say, really, this is a theory not of greatness, but of improvement, then he's dead on. And a lot of evidence on this. You don't become an airline pilot by going to college and then learning Shakespeare or whatever, and then suddenly you're able to fly a plane. You put him in a flight simulator. Learn by doing, practice doing that. Have someone who knows what they're doing say, don't press that dial, you will crash our plane.
That's his story. You climb a ladder, so to speak. You become an expert by getting experience.
Right. And really what I'm saying is that what most countries have decided to do is just to postpone the real skill acquisition period for more and more years. And then finally, your degree is your ticket not to actually being able to do the job. It's your ticket to finally being able to get the real job training that you've been waiting for your entire life.
So I understand this, and I think this is a true story. We have empirical evidence of this in Sweden as well. But what about the signaling part, where you say that it's a waste for society, but in fact, for me as an individual, it's still worthwhile to invest in these long educations.
Right.
And expensive education.
Yes. Well, so there's an old story about sitting down, or about being at a concert and you want to see better. Everybody's sitting down. What can one person do to see better when everyone else is sitting down? The answer is you stand up.
Yeah.
All right. Therefore, it follows, as night does day, that if everyone stands up, everyone sees better. Right? No, wrong. Right? And I say education basically works the same way. One more person gets education, doors open because they look better compared to the competition. But if everybody does it, the main thing that happens is employers just raise their expectations for how much education you need to not have your application thrown in the trash.
So employers are stupid.
Of course not. This is actually a very reasonable thing to do. So if you have 300 applications, you don't have time to actually interview 300 people. I mean, remember, the interviewing process uses up the time of some of the most skilled workers at whatever place you are. It could be the boss's own time, or it could be, for example, at a law firm. It might be that each person that you interview takes up 2 or 3 or 5 hours worth of the time of partners, people billing at $500 or $1,000 an hour. So if you have 200 applications for one job, you're not going to let 200 people go and each have 10 hours of time that's worth $1,000 per hour. Instead, you need to thin the herd, right? And one of the most obvious things to do is look at the stack and say, well, there may be some great workers who don't have these credentials, but we don't think there's very many. So let's say everyone who doesn't have a college degree, we throw them in the trash. Now we are down to a third as many applications. Or again, of course, if you have a very big stack, you may say, well, let's also throw away everyone who didn't go to a good enough school. Let's throw away everyone whose majors aren't good enough. Even if the major, you might say, look, yeah, we don't need a biologist here. But I think a biologist has to be a better, or is least likely to be a better candidate than an archaeologist. So let's throw away the majors that we think are easier, and then just interview people that have impressed us by doing something hard, even if the hard thing is not relevant to what we're doing.
So the harder, the tougher, the more demanding it is to come into the educational system and to be there as well, the more attractive you become on the labor market.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So Ivy League schools, they would have the highest payoff, so to speak,
Right.
for the investments.
Right. Right. I mean, of course, employers are going to look at not just the school, but also your performance. So it may be that the worst person at Harvard is considered to be less good than an average person at Penn State, right? Especially, you may say, like, why are you the worst person here? What happened? What went wrong? Everyone thought you were good, but somehow you fell short of your promise. Now I'm nervous about hiring you. I remember when I was, getting my PhD at Princeton, they were saying how, the worst person at Princeton, actually, people are nervous about that person. Like, I don't know about that person. Whereas, because they have failed, they were given this great opportunity, and yet they have failed to prove themselves. But yeah, the general point: the better you look in every way, the more persuasive your education is to employers, the more enticing it is, and the more they want to give you a chance.
So you have this overeducation, and when employers screen the potential people to hire, they use the signals that higher education and university education.
Right, and of course, not just higher, but also high school.
What do we signal if we manage to get, a master's degree at a prestigious university? That you can't signal if you haven't invested in that.
Right. Well, it's not that you can't. It's just one of the easiest and most persuasive ways. It's rare to have a system that is so rigid that there isn't any other way around it. So for being a university professor, that might be the most rigid one. That there, like, if you don't have a PhD, you just can't do it anymore. But most systems, there's a little bit of room, but just not that much. For example, Google does hire some people that didn't go to college because they won programming contests. But when I've talked to people at places like Google and say, well, how many programming contest winners do you hire versus how many people with CS degrees from top schools? Like, yeah, we hire like 5 contest winners, like 1,000 people from top schools. But what do you signal? But so, first of all,
what do you signal? What things do you signal back onto?
Yes, so first of all, just simply being smart, so smart or intelligent. So to be able to get in and do well suggests that you have you have good cognitive ability. But then it also indicates that you have a good work ethic. You can be super smart, but if you don't do your work, you will not be able to finish school. I had a friend who just refused to get out of bed sometimes, and so despite his brilliant intellect, he did not finish that degree. And then the last one, which is, I think, the key to understanding why the system is so long-lived, why it's so hard to change, is that you also just signal conformity. You say, look, in my society, we are expected to do a 4-year degree, and so I will do a 4-year degree. Here in Sweden, does the bachelor's degree take 3 or 4 years?
It's 3 years.
3 years.
But then most people take a master's degree nowadays.
Yes.
So we've prolonged it for 2 years.
But anyway, in a society where 3 years is what the bachelor's degree is, then you want to say, fine, I will comply with that rule. I will do 3 years, right? But which brings us to the really interesting thing: why is this system so hard to change? And I say, well, part of it is just that you have piles of government subsidies in favor of the status quo. But I think there's something deeper going on, which is if someone comes along and says, I have a new, novel, creative, fantastic way to signal your conformity, who are the first people in line to do this weird way of signaling conformity? They're probably going to be nonconformists. So the problem is that trying to signal conformity in an original way actually has this catch-22. Like, when you do it, you actually make yourself look less of a conformist. So once there's something that is considered normal, it's the way you show that you're normal, these things are very hard to change. And that's what's so depressing about the system.
So the tougher the education is, the harder you have to work, the harder is the value, because it signals something.
Right.
So that means that people who study humanities, arts, languages, and so on are not as well rewarded as people doing civil engineering or math, or that really requires hard work.
Yeah, of course. And now here's the thing. Partly you can say that civil engineers actually acquire more useful job skills, and I think that's got to be true. But that's why I like to say, let's go and compare what's considered an easier major to a harder major that's still highly impractical, like pure math. There's almost no jobs that use pure math, and yet if you do well in pure math, you can get a job in finance. Now, the kind of math you're doing, you are doing some kind of math in finance, but it's a totally different thing. You're not proving theorems. It's not real analysis. And it may be that the pure mathematician gets hired by a finance firm, and they say, okay, now you know anything about statistics? And like, no, I just prove theorems. Well, that's not going to be a problem, because statistics is a lot easier than proving theorems. So let's just, I think you've got the right stuff there. Whereas the English major, you hire a finance firm says, now let's teach you statistics. And then the English major makes right? Maybe we need to start culling. Right? And of course, now here's the key thing, and the sort of what's sad and unfair about signaling is there are people that are good who don't have the right signal, and there are people that are bad that manage to get the right signal anyway. And so a lot of what I say in the book is that, not only is it possible, but it is common for people to be either better or worse than their signal indicates. And the people who are better than their signal indicates are actually overpaid. And the people who are worse than their signal indicates are underpaid. And this is why a good person may find that they're not able to advance until they go and take time off from school or go to night school to go and get a degree. And then people say, oh, now we're convinced this is what you need to do to be able to cash in on your talent.
One of your interesting points in the book, I think, is that smart students only study for exams. They don't try to learn. I find that extremely controversial argument, but very interesting.
Right. Well, I don't say that smart students, but strategic students do this.
They want the degree, they want to do the exams, but they don't care about learning.
Yes, most. So so as I am a college professor, so I see this very readily that when do students start coming to my office? Right before the exam. That's when they finally are curious about what the material is. And how many students come a few days after the exam and say, I feel like my understanding is still inadequate. I'm really curious about this material. That almost never happens, right? Yeah. So, like some of the many signs that the signaling story is right, just the way that students search out for easy graders. They want people that give out the top grade. In Sweden, is it the A, or what is the top grade here?
It's an A nowadays.
Okay. Yeah, so they look for someone who gives you an A for very little work, very little learning. Yeah. If you're going to school to acquire skills, this would be very foolish and short-sighted, because you would be giving up your time. And I don't know, is school totally free here, or college totally free here?
It's totally free. All right.
So you're not getting
student loans, you use your time and so on. So it's still a big investment.
Yeah, but you still have to give up your time.
Yeah.
And so you do that, and if you go and try to study with professors that don't actually expect much of you, if you were here to if you're in school to learn skills, then you have wasted your time. But on the other hand, if you're there just to get a bunch of A's on your report card, then you've played the game and played it well.
What about generic skills? Many people will argue that critical thinking, ability to understand complex processes, analyze the world, what goes on, is especially important in a dynamic, globalized world where skills get outdated, traditional skills, and that would be my strongest critique of your book, I think, that you disregard these generic skills that you, in fact, acquire at university.
Yeah, so generic skills are very important.
Yeah.
However, there is a discipline that has been measuring improvements in these skills for over a century. It's called educational psychology. And their conclusion is that there's very little evidence that education actually does improve thinking skills, critical reasoning, or anything like that. So, and again, now it's hard to really convincingly explain why we should believe them, but like in a short amount of time, I'd say you really do need to read them. But I think my strongest case, my strongest short case is this: people who work in this area very much want to find that what you're saying is true. They desperately want it often.
People who work at universities.
Yes. Well, people who work in educational psychology. They like the idea that going to school trains the mind.
Sure.
And even if you're never going to use your knowledge of history, even if you're going to forget everything you learn about history, the fact that you went through that enables you to understand the world of business better or whatever. So anyway, they've done a lot of work on this, a lot of experimental, some non-experimental. And what they keep finding is that there's very little evidence this occurs. Rather, what they find is learning is highly specific. Just like I was saying, the way you get good at a job, it's not by studying logic and then this magically makes you a good pilot. The way that you get good at doing that job is by practicing being a pilot. The way you get good at public speaking is by doing public speaking. I mean, and you're like, how could this be? So, probably, I think that what you're talking about, it does occur. It's just so rare that it just doesn't show up in the data. So, when you meet,
I guess would be that students that really are interested in learning, that really, for example, I studied philosophy at university, and that was perhaps my best investment, to be honest.
Right.
I wasted some time studying economics because those models are not really relevant in the real world, but
so what I say is
some skills I think are fundamental that you actually can learn if you're interested.
Right. So
Yeah.
there's that interest. That's another
Yeah.
possibility, is that students just are cutting so many corners that
Yeah. To
even
get the
yeah,
exam,
yeah,
to
yeah.
get the
So
degree.
again, like the data is totally consistent with a motivated person would improve their thinking skills, and that would explain to you. However, hardly anyone is motivated. So that's one story which is consistent with the evidence overall.
Yeah.
Basically, as long as you add some conditions where these improvements are very rare, then it's okay. But again, but the other thing is, remember, there is a very natural human tendency to want to feel like what you've done in your life is worthwhile.
Sure.
And if you know that you've forgotten the material that was actually taught, it's very easy to say, well, but there's some other unmeasured and possibly unmeasurable benefits
Sure.
that I had.
Sure.
And what they do in educational psychology is try to say, let's try to measure some of these indirect or side benefits of education, and see what's really going on. And again, the main thing is, like, when you define it specifically enough to test it, then it's very hard to find.
You have a nuanced argument, I think, in the book, saying that it's an 80-20 balance here.
Mm-hmm.
It's 80% waste, it's 20% perhaps a good investment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Could it be the other way around?
It's logically possible,
Yeah.
but I'd say that the empirics are just strongly against it. Just beginning with looking at the curriculum, looking at how students spend their time. So I don't know what's going on in Sweden, but I know in the United States that the amount,
It's very similar.
Yes,
It's
yes,
very
yes,
similar.
yeah. So there's one thing that you do where it's not a waste of time for you, and that's the foreign language education.
Okay.
Yeah, as our conversation indicates, you actually do acquire knowledge of foreign language.
Americans don't
yeah.
have to.
Americans don't have to, but here's the thing: the system tries to teach foreign language still. It's so when you see that Americans can't speak any foreign language, it's not because we don't teach it in school. It is absolutely required. 2 or 3 years is normal.
You never practice it.
Never practice it, but all the teaching is terrible.
Yeah.
Right? But then why do we do it? Because you have to have it for college. State of California, 3 years of foreign language required even to be eligible to go to either of the state school systems.
So coming over, I think you're convincing in your arguments, and coming over to policy conclusions. I mean, It seems like we're in some kind of trap here.
Mm-hmm.
You have a large part of the
Right.
vocal population that have invested in this heavy, long, expensive education years. They wasted a lot of time here, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
But they say now that they're good, and they're employed because apparently the labor market takes these signals, so they really believe in them.
Right.
So what should we do about it?
Well, if the cause of credential inflation is a proliferation of degrees, then I say the way to get credential deflation is to make the degrees less common, right? And the simplest way of doing that is to reduce the funding and to make education less accessible. That's right, less accessible. But most people are just horrified by this idea, and they say, look, if the usual view that you're learning useful skills in school is right, then I understand your horror. But if what's going on is this rat race, then really I'm talking about disarmament here and going back to a world where you can get a good job right out of high school.
But haven't that been going on for a long time in the U.S.? It's extremely important to send your kids to college. And middle-class families have a terrible situation, I think, in the U.S., having to save for the kids and so on.
Right. I'd say that that's greatly exaggerated, because people who want to look at the cost of college usually go to the webpage and look at the list price. And actually, most people in America do not pay the list price. There's heavy discounting. It's a lot like flying on an airline, where most people are not paying the most expensive price. So there's a lot of discounting at college. So actually, like when you look at what's called net tuition, right now in the U.S., net tuition for a year of college is only about $4,000 full time. So it's much less
for 1 year.
Yeah, for 1 year. But again, so when a lot of that may sound like a lot to you, but so there's a lot of Americans who are thinking of it like 20, 30, 40,000, and that's just like for a rich kid going to Harvard, it is $50,000, but hardly anyone's paying that. Anyway, there's research that's been done on how much does changing this price change attendance, and usually the people doing this research are arguing for the Swedish system, that we want to go and cut the price so that more people go, so we can get more skills. I say, look, your methods are perfectly fine, but we should reverse the value and say, really, what we want to do is try to have fewer people going to school. Which, again, not to be mean, not to go and ruin people's lives. Again, the goal is to go back to a world where you can get a good job right out of high school, or maybe sooner.
One of your more optimistic points in the book is about vocational education.
Mm-hmm.
So if people overinvest in more academic education, and there's a big discussion worldwide about the academic drift within the educational system, everyone is supposed to become a PhD and a professor, which would not be a good thing, I think. So instead we should increase or perhaps have a high priority at least for vocational education.
That's right. So the United States is almost at the extreme of opposition to vocational education. We really do have a system of where the theory is college for all. Every kid, no matter how poorly he's done in school his entire life, should be prepared to go to college, right? And yet, statistically, the odds that someone who has done very poorly in school up to the age of 12 or 13 or 14 is going to turn around and become a good student and do well in college is very low. So, I say that it makes a lot more sense for kids like that to at least give them the option of being trained to do a practical skills, to be a plumber or an electrician or a carpenter. Americans are horrified by this usually. I mean, much more so than people in Europe, actually. I think this is one area where you're probably doing better than us.
Depends where you are in Europe.
Yes.
In Germany and continental Europe, it's very common, of course.
Right. Although, Germany is moving the American direction. It's actually Switzerland is the place where they keep where they hold
extreme in that
where they hold the torch up and say, our system's working. I'm like, well, I don't know what's wrong with you.
Switzerland do very well as a country as well. So
yes, and I have never heard anyone say the Swiss are not highly skilled. But so the Swiss I was talking to say only about 10% of the Swiss workforce would have bachelor's degrees. Vocational education still very common.
On high school level, 80% go into vocational education.
Yeah. So and again, this fits with the evidence from not just economics, from psychology, saying, look, you want if you're going to end up as a plumber, why not go and start training you to do it? Now, I think only a part of the reluctance is the idea that you're taking a 12-year-old and saying, you're a plumber, that's your life. But, there's no reason why you couldn't have a smorgasbord of vocational education when you're 12 or 13, where you get 2 weeks each of 20 different jobs.
You could try to teach some generic practical skills that will be useful in different educations.
Right.
Actually, I'm in favor of having mandatory on-the-job training in all kinds of university education, actually. Even in philosophy or math. You would have to go and work in a workplace for perhaps a semester or so to practice and use your skills.
So in the United States, what's striking is that one of the things that college students work hardest for is to get an unpaid summer job, but a summer job that is related to their field, where they are making connections that will be useful to them afterwards. And again, it's funny because people call this exploitation. And I always say, so when colleges charge you $4,000 or $10,000 or $50,000 a year to allegedly to give you skills, which they barely do, that's okay. But when an employer gives you skills for free, that's exploitation. And I say, look, this is just a bizarre misreading of the situation. These summer jobs are doing more for your actual skill development than almost any college program ever will. But it's still the employers that people are mad at rather than the colleges, which seems pretty crazy to me.
So I have a final question. I think it's been a very interesting discussion here, and it's interesting when the whole world, in a sense, have overinvested in something, and they think this is the way to the future, and you're saying we've done this in a slightly different way, at least. So do you have any signs of optimism that the understanding of this, misinvestment, malinvestment, policymakers or voters starting to realize this?
I don't think so. I mean, so the only sign of optimism I would say is just that in the United States there is now a higher level of resentment of higher education. But again, most of the resentment I fear is actually going to be channeled in in a counterproductive direction, because the usual complaint is just college is too expensive and student loans are bad because then students end up with a lot of debt. Now, one thing you might do is say, well, let's try to figure out a way to get people good jobs without the education. Although I think that, since it actually makes sense for people to do it, selfishly speaking, I don't think that's going to turn up anything well. But I fear that the more likely scenario is that people listen to Bernie Sanders, or say, let's be like Sweden and say, let's go and make it free, or let's go and make college loans even more subsidized than they already are. So again, when someone says so I actually had a piece in Newsweek about student loans, which are very unpopular, but there's two complaints you might have. One is to say people should be more cautious about taking loans, which I think makes a lot of sense. The other one, though, is to say that people should just receive college for free so they don't need a loan. And I think the second one has a lot more political appeal than the first one, unfortunately. So yeah, I would say that I don't have much optimism here. Like I guess the only thing that really makes me optimistic is that when I talk to people about their own experience, almost everyone agrees with me. And even when I talk to a bigger audience, people of very widely ranging ideologies, when I just present this argument to them, I get a lot of nodding until I say cut education. And that's where people say, no, 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 that's a terrible idea. And I say, but it follows directly from the logic of what I've said. It really does. So, why is it?
I think I'll end this with, with a comment that I will be looking forward to your next book then on how to avoid or get out of this educational trap that we're all caught in. And,
right, or actually, I hope that one of your listeners figures it out, because if in this book I can convince you we're in a trap, then I hope someone else who's better than me at marketing will figure out a way to sell this idea to a broader audience. But hopefully you are out there. Please.
Perhaps someone who hasn't wasted their time at the university, right?
Yeah, or maybe someone who's wasted so much time and it motivates them. They're bitter and they're ready to.
Thanks very much for coming up.
All right,
it's been great.
Always a
Thank
pleasure,
you.
Niels. Thanks so much.